Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on the channel with Dr. Lyn Kidson. We're going to be talking about 1 Timothy 2:12. We're talking about uh, can women preach? Can they teach? What does these verses mean? The surrounding context. Uh, how are you doing today, Dr. Kidson?
Well, thank you. And it's a cool day here in Sydney.
Awesome. Yeah, so this is funny because this is the second day in a row where I've interviewed an Australian. So I'm gonna get an accent before you. I'm gonna get my own accent before we know it here. So, um,
That's right.
yeah. So as I said, we're talking about First Timothy. You wrote your dissertation on that. Could you just give us a quick little intro into what that dissertation was about?
Yep. I'm actually an ancient historian because I did my study at Mohr University. But I'm a New Testament scholar as well because I did a Master of Divinity. Um, but it was in my Master of Divinity that you bump into the whole argument from 1 Timothy chapter 2 why women can't preach.
Mm,
Um, but when I did my assignment on, because I did my Master of Divinity part time because I had a baby, and so I done all my New Testament subjects and learnt how to exegete and all that. And when it came to writing the essay for theology, and I read through all the stuff, and I went, I don't understand how this all works. Like exegetically, it's a pretty weak argument.
mm,
Anyway, it took me a while to get around to doing a Master of Arts in Early Christian Jewish Studies at Macquarie Uni, and that's where I started working on my work on the 1 Timothy, and then um, yeah, then I went on to do my PhD on this letter.
mm,
So that my PhD is actually on the letter itself and how the letter works, because that's a big question. How does the
mm,
letter work? Um, so it's not, I didn't really talk about 2 Timothy, but have followed it up with um, uh, other work and eh, on the letter. So there's a book chapter on how 2 Timothy works, a couple of book chapters actually.
mm.
Uh, is that what you wanted that
Oh,
answer?
sorry, maybe I was a little unclear. No, just like what was the general thing you were arguing for? Like, obviously there's a lot of rhetoric that you talked about and ancient Greek sources and I guess like a father-son relationship, something like that. Just like your just general what you were arguing in your dissertation there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, what I looked at was chapter one and how chapter one relates to the rest of the letter.
Mm,
So, I did a lot of analysis on letter writing and how the letter is works as a letter. Um, but and the thing with the rhetoric, it's because letters were read out aloud. That's what they were designed to do, especially our New Testament letters.
mm,
They're meant to be read to the congregation. You sit and listen. So they use Paul in particular, quite master at rhetoric actually, used rhetorical devices to get their point across, what they wanted to say. So rhetoric is the skill or the art of speaking publicly.
mm,
It's oration. So there's masses and masses of training materials. So huge volume by Aristotle on rhetoric and other guide handbooks and things. So
mm,
there's lots we can know about um, how how ancient people thought, or ancient orators thought that rhetoric should work. So you can go and
mm,
look at that, and um, in first chapter 1 and 1 Timothy, a lot of those devices are quite clear. So that's how. So I started, but you've got to think about it in terms of the letter. So what I was saying was that the chapter 1 um, begins as a letter, and then at So, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, and to Timothy. Then there's the prayer, grace, mercy, and peace. And then he dives off into what I said was a digression, which is a
Mm-hmm.
thing that's used in rhetoric, which kind of like is a summary and the programmatic statement of what is to come later. Don't normally see it in a letter, but here it is, because you can be creative in letter writing. And I said from verse 3 all the way down to the end of the chapter, which is sorry, got to verse 20. It's this digression, and it sets out the program. So, and the statement of problem. So, statement of problem, how to fix it, is kind of all contained in this digression. And then he goes back in chapter 2, verse 1, is how you would start a letter, which is, first of all, so there's this weird thing in the middle, which is a digression.
Huh.
And so the tells us what the big problem is, and it's these two men, Hymenaeus and Alexander, who have been teaching this other teaching, which has caused all sorts of problems in the congregation. They've been removed, and so but what he wants to say is that he was like these arrogant men who thought they knew what they were doing once upon a time too. But he was called back into service. Paul was called back, on the road to Damascus. So I think what he's saying is that Hymenaeus and Alexander being removed from the community, but they can come back in because Christ is merciful. It's the gospel, really. That's my big conclusion, was that, this is just the outworking of the gospel. So even though they've done the wrong thing and caused a lot of fights and arguments and things in the congregation, they can come back in. But, they've got to come back in willing to be obedient to the sound instruction that conforms to the glorious gospel of the blessed God entrusted to Paul. So they've got to be willing to go along with what Paul says. And the instructions are what comes after from verse 1, chapter 2. First of all, let me tell you what you got to do.
I see. Yeah, no, it's really interesting when you were going through it, because as I guess, I mean, I don't know about you in Australia, but Americans, 21st century Americans, like I'm reading the First Timothy, and Paul's talking about like all of this stuff, like my journey, and these teachings, and he's like saying all these odd things that it's like, why is he talking about this? Like, they just seem so random. And something I liked a lot about your dissertation was like, when you look at it and the perspective of what Paul's doing, it makes a lot of sense in regards to ancient rhetoric, and as you're talking about the
So
digression
he's
and
trying
commands
to
and all that. Yeah.
persuade the congregation um, to continue on with his instruction and not follow the instruction of Hymenaeus and Alexander, because that's what that word means. I mean, in the so in verse 3 of chapter 1, he says instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine, which sounds kind of like kind of any random doctrine. Doctrine's not a very good translation there. It's instruction. So it's the particular instruction that Alexander and Hymenaeus have been promoting. And its actual word there, if I look at the Greek, so it's the heterodidascally, to teach another instruction.
Yeah, and that's a really, it's like a hapax legomena, right?
It is. So that just means it's a word that doesn't appear anywhere else. It's because the flexibility of Greek. It's a bit like German. You can stick words together and it's okay. So it should be a noun, but he's turned it into a verb,
Hmm,
which I must say
interesting.
we can do in English as well, but it just sounds a bit odd. Um, so one of the things that drives me mad with Australian rules football is that the commentators like to say, "Oh, he goaled." It's like, no, he didn't. He kicked a goal.
Oh,
So they took a noun and they've turned it
yeah,
into a verb, and that's actually a good illustration, I think, because that's kind of what he's done here.
yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, so more on to I guess the topic of today. So that's just a little bit of the intro of like your dissertation, but in regards to First Timothy 2, like 12 to 15, around that area, you've written on that as well in other peer review and stuff like that. So could you talk about how the teaching of, like, saying women shouldn't be teaching or exercising authority, or however you want to translate that, what is your view on that? And I guess, how does that relate to First Timothy 1?
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's not general instruction not to teach. In fact, it just doesn't kind of make exegetically, it kind of doesn't make sense because it's like it says in the NRSV, it says 12 do prevent no woman to teach nor have authority over a man. um a lot of people want to say, oh, the man bit belongs to the teaching bit, but there's these two infinitives. um the man is in uh a man is in the genitive, which belongs to the word that comes before it, the infinitive before um, the authority word there,
Hmm.
what's translated as authority, um, authoritio, but it doesn't belong to the word that comes before it, because normally an infinitive takes an accusative. So there's no kind of subject, if you want, for to teach. It's
Hmm.
just to teach. But you really should have something that follows after it. So I think what he's saying is, because he spent all of chapter 1 saying don't teach the other teaching,
Hmm.
and then he refers to it again, in verse 8, which begins this whole, from verse 8 in chapter 2 to the end 15. It's just, one kind of section,
Hmm.
block of teaching. Um, he says, I desire then in every place men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. So he's referring back to the problems in the community that have been created by the other teaching.
Hmm.
So and the weird thing is with verse 12 is that the infinitive to teach is stuck at the front of the sentence. Like,
Hmm.
normally it would be further back in the sentence, like authoritaine is. So he's making to teach prominent, puts it at the front. So he's just picking back up on the not to teach the other teaching. It's kind of like, don't teach the other stuff. But he's already said all that.
Hmm.
So he's just saying, don't permit a woman to teach what dot dot dot. Well, it's got to be referring to the other teaching. So he's not saying it's the heresy or the other teaching, the other instruction. So he's
Hmm.
not ruling out women not teaching forever and ever and a day,
Hmm.
anywhere, everywhere.
Interesting.
That doesn't
Okay.
make sense.
Hmm.
It doesn't make sense in the ancient world, like, either. because if you're a woman in a household, then and later on, it gives instructions to the slaves, which can be male, female slaves, and talks about masters or mistresses. A woman has to be able to have authority over male human beings if she's going to direct the activities in her household. And if she's a Christian woman, then she's going to be instructing them in the gospel. So, see what I mean?
Yeah.
So we can't be just saying not to teach ever, never, ever, ever.
Yeah.
So it's, to me, that means that whole argument that just means globally, a woman can teach in church just crumbles.
Well, so you said that, so later they talk about, in order to, I guess, run your household well, you have to be able to teach, other men. But maybe that's why.
Well, male human beings, because male slaves aren't men. They're kind of, slaves are in a in-between kind of state between being children and being adults. Right? It's the boy or the girl.
No
matter how old they are.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Interesting. So what I was going to say was that, so, obviously a lot of, complementarians will say, hey, well, this context is talking about like the church atmosphere, not specifically like every single instance where, teaching could be involved. So it's okay if, women teach in a classroom or maybe in, as you talked about, like the home, but not specifically in the church environment. So I mean, what do you think about the possibility of that specifically? Like, why would you be against that interpretation there?
Yeah, but the problem right from the start is the other instruction that's being taught in church or taught in church circles, because we have people going from household to household in chapter 5. Yeah, he's telling them that they can't teach that. But the problem, but really, I think when we're getting all the way down, we've gone from, in chapter 2, we go from like prayers for the emperor and all authorities, kings and things. Then we sort of move on to like praying, perhaps in a church meeting, and then we're progressing down to like then he changes from like the from talking for men and women to like singular, a woman, a man. So I think that means that he's shifted to like husbands and wives, because you can translate the man and as husband and wife, a woman as wife. So I think we're progressing down from bigger down to smaller. So because the problem is we have to get to the actual what the instruction is, which is an asceticism. So wives, don't try and convince your husband, persuade them, which is kind of what the teaching there can mean, that word. Didasco can mean to persuade, because teaching is about persuading. We're in a culture that highly values rhetoric. Don't try and persuade your husband, to take up the other teaching, which is kind of wrecked things.
I see. And then what was that other verse? So I don't have the notes open here. The specific you mentioned about the aestheticism. Where does that verse come from?
Yeah. So in chapter 4, in verse 1, he says, "Now the Spirit expressly says in later times that some will renounce the faith by paying attention to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons or the instructions of demons
Mm-hmm.
um, through the hypocrisy of lies. And it goes on and on, like this is long sentence all the way down to verse 5.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, yeah, but in verse 3, he says, they forbid marriage and demand abstinence from food. So everyone that I know, and Philip Towner wrote one of the major commentaries.
Mm-hmm.
It's that Tabba teaching is about asceticism. So it's not being married and or taking up a continent life, not having sexual relations, and having a strict diet. Because they thought that they could use diet to control their sexual urges, which is true. If you starve yourself enough, your libido disappears.
Fair enough.
Yep. So
Yeah.
that's what the other instruction is. And we know that this is what's all being about because he tells us like repeatedly throughout the letter because it's bookend. So verse 3, it's about the other instruction at the very end of the letter when he signs off. He says, Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you. Avoid the profane chatter and contradictions of
Mm.
what is falsely called knowledge, or this other instruction. Um,
Mm.
by professing it, some have missed the mark as regards to the faith, which he says that's what Hymenaeus and Alexander have done there. Suffered shipwreck, missed the mark, missed the
Yeah.
port, wrecked the ship. But earlier on, right at the very beginning, he says, chapter 6, some have deviated or missed the mark. It's actually the same wording there.
Mm.
From being a pure heart and good conscience and sincere faith, and turn
Mm.
to meaningless talk, desiring to be teachers of the law. So the whole letter is bookend by talking about this other teaching. Then, as I said in chapter 2, verse 8, he refers to the problems in the community again about the anger because they're fighting about it. And then, in halfway through the letter, chapter 3, verse 14, he stops and says, I have to come to you soon, but I'm writing these instructions to you so that if I'm delayed, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God. So he's like repeating what he's saying
Mm.
there. And
Yeah.
then in chapter 6, we haven't finished yet. In chapter 6, he says, verse 3, whoever teaches otherwise, which is exactly the same word as taxolegomena in verse 3, chapter 1. The different doctrine. It's the same word there.
Mm.
Whoever teaches otherwise does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the teaching that is in accordance with godliness is considered understanding nothing, and is a morbid craving for controversies and disputes about words. So they're fighting a lot.
Mm. Yeah.
So the whole letter is permeated, started with constant references to this other teaching and what's been going on, being caused by Hymenaeus and Alexander's promotion of this other teaching. So when he says, I do not permit a woman to teach, well, it's pretty obvious, I think, that he's talking about the other, this other teaching, because it's all in one big long flow from
Mm.
verse 8, where he refers to it there.
Mm. Okay, so in that case, if this referring women not teaching, they must learn instead. if it's sort of reference to all these other mentions of wrong teaching, then what do you think is the reason of mentioning Adam and Eve, and Adam being formed first?
Yes. So good question. Um, so, so in chapter 1,
Mm-hmm.
he names him and Alexander, and to name people that you are in conflict with is to shame them. But it's okay because, they've already been shamed by being removed from the community.
Mm-hmm.
They've been through a whole process. There's a whole process to the removal of people from community. And my former colleague at Alpha Cruises, Adam White, has written about that discipline of in the ancient church.
Hmm.
So they've already been through a process. They've already been people. Everyone knows that they've been disciplined. So he's not really adding to the shame at all. But then he says right at the beginning, if we notice, you know, instruct certain people. So he hasn't actually said who the certain people are because he doesn't want to shame them because they're still in the community, right? So he's being kind of roundaboutish, and this is kind of a rhetorical, careful rhetoric on his part.
Mm-hmm.
So when he says, "I permit no woman," or "I do not permit a woman," he's not actually naming anyone. So it's kind of like general. If this applies to you, take note. Not to. So let's say, no, don't permit woman to persuade or to bully her husband. Um, she's to be quiet. So quietness means like continue to be dignified. So it's a really important idea in the pastoral epistles. But it doesn't mean not to speak at all.
Hmm.
In speaking in appropriate fashion. Which the men are to do as well. That's what, they're praying in a dignified, appropriate fashion. They're not arguing and they're not in anger or arguing. So whatever applies to the men applies to the women. That's what the likewise is doing in verse 9. There's a likewise in verse 9. In the NRSV it says also, but likewise the women. Just for the men, just for the women.
Hmm.
So they're to keep quiet. Then he says, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." So it's Adam was formed. So it's a response to the other teaching, I think, because it's about. So if we go back to chapter 4, verse 3,
Mm-hmm.
it says they forbid marriage or they forbid sexual relations. So this is about the formation of Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve were created to have sexual relations. When he says that, they forbid marriage, then which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. So he's saying that this is what they are formed for.
Hmm.
So don't teach the other teaching, which is to give up sexual relations in marriage. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, because that's what they were formed for.
Hmm.
And then Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. But so in this bit, she's acting as an example, which she does over in Corinthians, by the way, 2 Corinthians. 11 verse 3.
Mm-hmm.
Can we go there?
Yeah, sure.
Paul says, but I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts may be led astray from sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So I think he's using Eve in verse 4 as a 14, sorry, as an example, just as him and as an example of what happens when you teach the other teaching, and you get kicked out of your community after causing enormous arguments and disruption. So he's warning the women that, like Eve, they could be deceived and become sinners by creating, anger and arguments within their marriage, like Hymenaeus and Alexander created arguments within the church.
Okay. So just for some clarity there. So I think a lot of people focus on the first language. So like, Adam was formed first, then Eve second. And I think they focus on that a lot because it's like, well, why bring up the order of things if they're just referencing, just them as an example for some, marriage or however you would put it. So like, for example, Paul or whoever wrote this could have said Adam and Eve were formed, and Adam was not deceived. Like they could have said that, but no, it just said Adam was formed first, then Eve. So why do you think they mentioned the order at all then?
Yeah, because it's why was Eve formed? What
Why
does
was she
Genesis
formed?
say?
Oh, because the man was he was alone and
He was
needed a helper.
alone. Yes, that's right. And what happens after Eve was formed? What did they do?
Well, uh,
Oh, it's essential for human
yeah,
beings to continue to be human beings.
yeah, they were, I guess, I don't know the exact words that you used, but
Yeah.
they were put together, right?
Adam knew Eve. Yeah.
Mm,
And it's the refrain right throughout Genesis. Um, so I think when he says for Adam was formed first and then Eve, it's he's correcting the teaching of whatever the other people are saying. Because remember I read this out
mm,
back in chapter 1, desiring to be teachers of the law.
mm,
They think, yeah, but without understanding either what they are saying or the things of which they are making assertions,
mm,
they think they know what they're talking about when they're teaching the Old Testament. So notice that we're in the law here with Adam and Eve. So I think he's correcting them
mm.
about their. So I'm guessing from what I can, because I haven't written about this yet, but I'm getting ready to do so.
Oh, snap.
That it's some sort of strange teaching about Adam being perfect in paradise and not wanting to go back to that idea of being in paradise and not being alone and not being not having sexual relations.
Mm,
Adam was formed first in perfect in this perfect state where he didn't have to have, because they're in this era that are really worried about sexual relations, right?
mm,
Tatian and some and other early Christians in the 2nd century
mm,
thought you were sinning when you had sex, whether we were in marriage or not.
mm.
But our you know, our writer here doesn't think that. He thinks it's good. So I think that's what he's doing. He's correcting their misguided teaching on on Adam. It's
Interesting.
the Adam's the problem, not the Eve.
I
So then he
see.
says, and then Eve was formed. Well, why was she formed? What was she formed for?
Mm,
Um, she was formed to have sexual relations so that they could have the next generation.
I
So,
see.
which then makes sense of verse 15. And this is the thing I wanted to know when I was doing my MDiv all those years ago.
Oh yeah.
How does 15 work? Well, yet, well, what does it say? It's not very good. And so, um, the woman will be saved. So she was saved from this other teaching that causes all sorts of problems, like big arguments, um, and be saved through the bearing of children. Um, because what happens? What happens when you have sexual relations?
Children most of the
You have
time.
children. Yeah. So she's putting into action what she's been told to do earlier, which is to obey, to learn in silence, to learn in quietness, to take up this the instruction, the good instruction that's in this letter
Mm,
by having sexual relations, therefore having children. She's saved from the problems caused by this other instruction, the asceticism, um, provided they, husband and wife,
mm.
um, continue in faith, in love and holiness, and with modesty. Holiness with modesty. That's kind of a way you can describe appropriate sexual relations in the bedroom. So I've got
Interesting.
evidence for that as well.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, so that I think that kind of sums your view up very well there. So I did want to talk about the topic of like honor, piety, and I guess a little bit of your, like the father-son relationship you talked about in your dissertation. So, um, so I don't know. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but maybe could you just give us like a little bit of background as regards to what do you think the ancient reader, how would they have seen like honor, piety, and this background context, so that so we can get to the head of the original reader when they come to this passage, or of the writer, what they're thinking as they're writing these things, like um like
You
just.
mean the letter as a whole? Yeah. So piety is loyalty.
Mhm.
So being loyal. Um, so what I said in my dissertation is that Timothy is a model of um, a son because he's dressed as son, my loyal child. And this is lovely. That word there, technon, it's often used on epitaphs. When a young man dies, his parents would engrave um, the headstone using this word. It means it's like my sweet child, my
Yeah.
little boy, that kind of idea. um, yes, so my loyal child in the faith. So I think he's really saying Timothy is like his adopted son, who cares very much about. And Timothy becomes like in the letter um, the example of what it means to follow Paul's instruction.
Hmm.
Um, so he's being told not to tell the others, these certain people, to instruct them, not to teach as they were teaching. But in his life and manner, um, he is to embody these instructions. So that's a thing that I find some people miss. It's not, it's not a letter setting out commands, do this, do that, don't do that. But in the end, it's about who you are as a believer in Christ. The
Hmm.
way you conduct yourself, the way you interact with other people you're meant to embody it,
Hmm.
and that's what Timothy is described as doing in this letter.
Hmm.
Um, the whole idea, oh, it's about authority. No, it's about who you are.
Hmm.
It's not about one person having authority over another. It's about embodying that kind of Christ-likeness that you
Hmm.
see in this letter. So, he says the aim of this instruction, what he's giving in the letter, in chapter the 1, verse 5, the aim of this instruction I'm giving is love.
Hmm.
So, 1 Corinthians 13, what's love like? Love is that's the whole point of this whole letter is that rather than causing anger and disputes among other believers, it's to seek their best.
Hmm.
Yeah, right. Um, and this love comes from pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. So they're things that you embody as internal characteristics. These are the things that are important. Um, and so what I said was that Hymenaeus and Alexander have given lip service to following Paul in his instructions.
Hmm.
Um, but they've run off as if like people of hubris. They've they've decided they know best, and they're teaching their own instruction and not following the instruction of Paul. So they say that they're loyal to Paul,
Hmm.
but they're not. They've
Hmm.
run off on their own little look how great we are, a bit like the super apostles in Corinthians. We're
Hmm.
wonderful. Follow us. We
Yeah.
know better than we know better than Paul. But
Right.
they're kind of not saying that out loud. It's just the way what they're doing with their actions.
Hmm.
Yeah. So is that what you mean? And piety is about in the Roman world being pious is there's like two mentions. There's a vertical dimension, so rightness before the gods,
Hmm.
and right action on a horizontal level between yourself and your family and your um, community and your nation. So kind of extends out in ever increasing circles.
Hmm.
So what I'm going to say. So pietas, which um, permeates not just 1 Timothy, but 2 Timothy and Titus. It's about correct living, as I was saying before God and with others, living correctly. Um, and what embodies, sums that all up is love.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, so that's like the general. Did you talk about honor yet? The importance of honor in regards to the background context of this passage.
Yes. So, of course, one honours one's parents. So that's why Timothy is presented as the ideal son. Um, you know, honour your father and your mother, or in Leviticus, it's honour your mother and your father. It's the other
Hmm.
way around. Yeah. So in ancient tradition, or even traditional societies that we still have today, honouring your parents um, by trying your very best to do what they stand for, live up to their ideals.
Hmm.
It's just it's more than just like being obedient because you have to. It's about honoring them as human beings
Hmm.
because they want the best for you, so you honor what they have to say. That's like in 10 Commandments, honor your mother and father so it may go well with you in the land, because all parents want the best for their children, even
Hmm.
if you live in an Iron Age society. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, so honor honor is about is what Timothy is doing here. is honouring by being loyal to
Hmm.
Paul and his teaching.
Interesting. Okay.
Mm.
So you wrote a lot about that in your dissertation, and let's see. Okay, yeah. So, sorry, let me read my notes here. Okay, so, does okay? So you talked about what Hymenaeus and Alexander would have been talking about. Let's see. Yeah. So I'm gonna try to put this on the screen here. But you talked about there's an ethical progression which connects chapter 1 through chapter 2. So
Exegetical progression. Yeah.
okay. Okay. Um, so it goes from 2 to 2:15, and then that connects with the first chapter. Uh, and I'll put it on the screen. It's basically like in Greek, it's I extort therefore, something like that, in 2:1, and that somehow connects it. So what is the connection between chapter 2 and chapter 1?
Yeah. Okay. So in verse 1 of chapter 2 there, you'll have a therefore.
Uh-huh.
So to have a therefore, you've got to have something that goes before it.
Mm-hmm.
So as I said at the very beginning, I talked about the digression. So you have this digression. Here's like the programmatic statement.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the problem. He discusses the problem. This is what has been done about the problem, how to fix the problem. So we get to verse 20 in chapter 1. Or 19, some have shipwrecked their faith. Among them are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have turned over to Satan, so been removed from unity. So they may learn not to blaspheme.
Mm-hmm.
So they've been really confident about what they think God wants. A bit like Paul thought he knew what God wanted and headed off to Damascus. But they'd be wrong. So, and they're kind of blaspheming because they think they know what God wants when they don't. And then he says, therefore, and then he gives first of all. So here we go. These are the instructions that follow on, directly on from the digression.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing he says to do is about the prayer. So what's the opposite of blaspheming? This is basic rhetoric, right? Basic rhetoric is you use contrasting. Here's one thing, don't do that, do this other.
Hmm.
Blaspheming is a vice. What are you going to do instead? Well, it's to be pious, as we were talking about before. So it's the whole of chapter 2 is about how to be pious.
Hmm.
So we start off by praying for and with supplications, prayers, intersections, and thanksgivings for everyone, for kings, and for all who are in high positions. So we're living a quiet and peaceful life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that we can get on with the instructions that Paul has given us in the positive instructions, which is to promote the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right.
So yeah, then
Which
keep
he
going.
kind of sums up there in verse 5. For there is one God, there is also one mediator between God and humankind, Christ Jesus himself, human, gave himself for a ransom for all. So there we are. We have the gospel there, and it's a very serious business to pray on the behalf of the empire,
Mm-hmm.
praying for the well-being of everyone.
Mm-hmm.
It's important stuff. So and then picks up on this theme in verse 8, because he gets a little distracted there, because then he goes on and talks about himself in verse 7. So he picks back up on the theme So we've got the un, so he just repeats the un. Right, so picking back up on the therefore, which connects back to chapter 1. Therefore, I desire in every place men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger and dispute. Yep, so it's just repeating there. So we're back on track. And in verse 9, it's likewise, so what the men are to do. So likewise, the women are to conduct themselves appropriately. So, not in anger or dispute. So a way a woman might do that is to dress appropriately. It's expressing the internal, what's internal, externally. So they're not being, so if you were to dress, with the braided hair, the gold pearls, the expensive clothes, you're saying something about your internal being, that somehow, if you are able to do that, you're more wealthy, and somehow you think you're better than the rest of the people in your congregation. So, that reflects like it's kind of an arrogant stance. So,
Yeah.
which is he wants to avoid, because that's, likewise the men were doing that too. Because he actually says, at the very beginning of chapter 1, that the people are being arrogant.
Yeah. Yeah. So not to interrupt you there, but so for example, in the NRSV UE, the updated edition of the NRSV,
Yeah.
it says also that. So
Sorry. It's likewise. It's a much better word, English word to go there.
So
they're to be modest.
So I guess
themselves.
an important point there is, so it seems that this translator is saying it's like in addition to, but you
Yeah.
say it's likewise a better way to think about it. So as
Yes, because people get confused. It's like, oh, is the likewise relating to the prayer? How is it? Because they're not talking about prayer in verse 9, but he's not. The focus isn't the prayer. It's It's being how to be pious, or and he actually says there in verse 9, right? The women are to dress. It's like that language from Colossians, dressing, to dress themselves in reverence. So that's actually you could translate it as godly piety. Be godly.
yeah.
Right? And self-control. In other words, don't anger. That's the opposite to what the some men have been doing, which is the anger and disputing.
I see.
You see what I mean? So lifting holy hands without anger and dispute. Oh, excuse me. It is to live with reverence and self-control. See, there's the likewise. That's where it comes from. That's how it works. It's not about the praying. It's about it's the theme of piety all the way through. Having correct relations with the divine and correct relations with one's fellow human beings in a horizontal plane. Okay, how are we going? Then we go to verse 10, which is but. So in contrast to the braids and the gold and the pearls and the expensive clothes. So it's but with good works. Then verse 11 continues on. Verse 11 doesn't belong to verse 12. Verse 11 belongs to verse 10 because it's rounding off. Let a woman learn in quietness. It's quietness there. So, conducting herself in appropriate fashion with reverence and self-control doesn't mean not to speak. Let me say that yet again. In submission, which means submission to Paul, or the letters, the writer's instructions. Right? Okay, so then we have in verse 12 the de, which is an additional thought flowing on.
Mm.
Um, so the debt's there. And then we have another one in verse 15, which another debt. So continue on the thought. So it's how it kind of all strings together. So all the way, so verse 15 is all strung together, can connect with the oon of verse 1 in chapter 2, which
Hmm.
is connected exegetically to chapter 1.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So yeah, let me put that on the screen here. So um, so yeah, hopefully people can see
Yeah,
that. Uh,
yeah,
yeah. So each of these words basically form a string of connecting thought throughout the entire chapter. That's what you argue, correct?
yes, that's right. It's very nicely put together.
Appreciate it.
It's written well.
I tried. Yeah. And of course I took a lot of that just from your paper, but um, yeah, no. So that specifically you mentioned the de, which is specifically in verse chapter 2:12. So to teach, and then however is that de word. Um, so maybe you can explain people how does that connect with the previous thought. So um,
Oh, I see.
yeah, maybe go in a little bit more detail there.
Um,
I guess just to be clear, so I guess people maybe not familiar with this line, this way of writing, might just not see as that very significant. So maybe could you talk about that a little bit?
yeah. So, where are we? So I'm saying verse 11 rounds off what has been said before, but he does this kind of all the way through. Does this kind of like hooked connection thing.
Mm,
So he's he moves to the singular woman there in verse 11, which he then goes on to talk about I permit no woman. So but he's actually has summarized or rounded off because the learning quietness is about how you conduct yourself, as I said.
mm,
Um, so it's like a concluding thought, really. He's kind of repeating himself there.
mm,
And then he says, then there's a debt. So having said the positive thing,
mm,
which is to learn in quietness and in submission to Paul, to the instruction, to Paul's teaching, then he continues on with a thought about what not to do.
mm,
I permit no woman to do not permit a woman to teach. So it really is reflecting what he says in verse 8 about the men. So might notice that this whole passage is really focused on the women. So
mm.
having like spent an entire chapter talking about the men and
Yep.
what they're meant not to do, and not to be like Alexander and Hymenaeus. Um, he's moved on to talking about um, what the woman isn't to do.
Mm,
And of course, it's kind of more focused on the personal, individual relationship she has with her husband, rather than speaking publicly in church. That doesn't kind of make sense, I don't think, for this. Um, because in ancient society, women didn't tend to address crowds anyway. Like women don't do that. It's not appropriate. So it's the thing that people worried about was, what a woman could convince her husband to do when she's alone with him. So this just reflects like normal way for ancient people to think. That would be about the husband and wife. So the so he's just saying what positive thing to do, which is to conduct yourself in quietness, and then the negative thing, which is not to teach the other instruction. Does that make sense? Which is kind of reflected in verse 8 anyway. So verse 8, men should pray, conduct themselves appropriately without anger and dispute. It's kind of reflecting that pattern. I'm trying to say about the pattern.
Yeah. I think that's a good word for it. Yeah, right. Of course, you've got like, but with good deeds, but I do not allow, but she will be delivered. Or
yes,
you also have but the woman. So I don't know if all those are the same words, but
let me say, did I accidentally skip over there? No, it's another de. It's not a hard L.
Okay,
In verse
gotcha.
14. For Adam was formed first. Is that right? Then Eve and Adam was not deceived. So I think the translators have judged that it's it's kind of contrasting. So they've translated it as but it's a de.
I see. Okay. All right.
So in verse 10, it's our, so it's a hard but in contrast. But in verse 14, it's also and, but you could say but, I guess. Eve was deceived.
Okay. All right. So enough of that. Let's keep going here.
Yeah.
So let's see what else we have. So obviously, yeah, one thing is that, you talked about like this teaching, 1 Timothy 4, 1-3, where it talks about teaching aestheticism and all that kind of stuff. So, that's like, 2 whole chapters after the chapter 2, right? Or, it's pretty far apart. So I guess some people would say like, hey, that's not the immediate context of what Paul's talking about. So what do you think about that? Like, don't you think that's like, a little off topic, or obviously not, but why do you think that is specifically in reference?
Yeah. Well, as we went through before, right throughout the letter, he refers to the other teaching. So there's these kind of pillars throughout the letter. Returns her. But okay, so as I've read before in chapter 3, verse 14, he goes back to the beginning. He says, I hope to come to you soon, which it's basically verse 3, chapter 1. I urge you, as I did when I was on my way to Macedonia, to remain in Ephesus. So he's gone back to talking about what he started the letter off with. So, and what did he start talking about at the beginning of the letter? What's the big problem? Well, it's the telling Timothy to instruct certain people, not to teach the other instruction. So we're back to that.
So really, what you're saying is it's a continuous theme throughout the letter, with maybe some breaks here and there, but
Yeah.
but just in chapter 4, he's specifically going just in a little bit more detail about what the specific teaching is, rather in the first two
Yeah.
chapters he's a
So
little
he
bit more
kind of
vague.
like in that first part, he says what he has to say and then he says it again. So
Hmm.
chapter 1 to chapter 3, verse 13, he has stuff to say, he says it, and then he stops, and then he kind of starts again and repeats what he says, but it kind of in more detail. So
Hmm.
in a way, you've got to read the second half of the letter to find out some more of the detail about what's going on in the first half of the letter. So he gives
Hmm.
more detail. And this is kind of a natural thing that happens in letter writing, um, because letters aren't necessarily written all in one go. You write and then
Hmm.
you stop, go have dinner, chat, go to bed, get up in the morning, start again. Um, and he's like thought about it, got more to say.
Hmm.
Um, so he's giving more detail and more things he wants to say.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes
yeah.
sense. Um. So.
So it's not kind of
Hmm.
higgledy piggledy hodgepodge. Because if you're going to argue what you were just saying, you're
Hmm.
back to what Degression said, the German scholar from the 19th century.
Okay.
Um, Let me read it out. That Conzelman was the translator. So this Conzelman's translation or explanation of what Degression said.
Yeah.
We cannot with equal certainty identify basic body of materials in 1 Timothy, for there the interest is directed to two main points, church order and refutation of heretics.
Hmm.
But even apart from this twofold interest, the character of church order materials themselves cannot seem uniform. So this is what my dissertation was about. Was well, yes, there is. It makes sense. It all hangs together. It's not two separate things.
Hmm.
There.
Yeah.
The letter works as a whole because there's two things he's trying to do. There is two things he's trying to do. Thing one is that he's trying to stop people from teaching the other instruction about asceticism.
Hmm.
Thing two is that he's trying to repair the damage that's been done by the big arguments that have taken place,
Hmm.
and the um, I don't know. It's like, have you been involved in a church split? It's really horrible.
Yeah.
Um, all that nasty stuff. Because
Sure.
like he says in chapter 6, he tells us in chapter 6 in great detail. Whoever teaches, the other instruction does not agree with the sound teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the teaching that is in accordance with godliness, is conceited, understanding nothing, has a morbid craving for controversies and for
Hmm.
disputes about words. Um, from these come envy, dissension, slander, base suspicions, and wrangling among those who are depraved mind and bereft of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain. Like, they're in a bad state.
Hmm.
That's why he goes and he talks about church orders. It's not a manual for how to run a church
Hmm.
forever and ever a day, universally. It's a manual for how to fix things when it goes horribly wrong.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, so that was kind of related to my next question. So in First Timothy 2, you've got all these seemingly random mentions of women dressing differently, men praying with their hands up, women teaching, or in this case, they don't, Paul doesn't want them to teach, and then Genesis. But then all of a sudden, you go to verse chapter 3, where it's about overseers or deacons, however you want to translate those words. And it just seems like it's just randomly going to, hey, this is how, like, this is church positions that you're supposed to, I guess, run the church. So maybe one more time, could you go over that? Like, how do you connect the what seems to be like these? this is the position you're supposed to have on a church. How do you connect that with the poor teachings?
Yeah. So, okay. So by verse 15, he's done with talking about the women. Um, so he moves on. So there's a hard break between verse 15 and verse 1 of chapter 3. So he moves on to talk about the office of bishop.
Hmm.
And I don't think it takes much to work out that that's probably the aim. What was the aim of Jimenez and Alexander, was that they wanted to be the overseer.
Oh, interesting.
They wanted to run things because they're telling people they forbid marriage. You know, they're the ones giving the instructions, as if um, they are in some sort of office of authority.
Hmm.
Um, so, in response to this kind of takeover,
Hmm.
so that's what I concluded my dissertation was that Jimenez and Alexander and their supporters have attempted to take over a church. He outlines the um, the qualities of a bishop
Hmm.
or overseer. So they've always had an overseer. So there's elders mentioned right at the end towards the end of the letter. That's not such a problem, it seems. It's this overseer. So you had like a board, had a board of elders, and then you had like the person who ran the board is the overseer. That's what overseer means. Um, and that person is in a position of some authority and influence. Um, and I think that's what Alexander or Hymenaeus, must be Hymenaeus is probably was aiming for. And so that's why it's all about the qualities of what an overseer must be. So must be above reproach. So, and the second thing is must be married once. So
Hmm.
in other words, because he's addressing, it's not about the forever church, right? A universal. He's addressing the very particular problem that has been here. So
Hmm.
these men are ascetics, they're not married. So he wants the overseer to be a married person. Um, so we're getting away from the problem of the faction that wants the whole church to be an ascetic club.
Hmm.
Right?
I see. Yeah, that is interesting, especially that it's second on the list there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable,
Yeah.
able to teach, apt teacher, and in other words, able to, as I said before, um, able to present a case, they're able to speak, um, uh, and then knows their scripture because, obviously they've got to know their scripture. Yeah, so, and then, he says these not a drunkard. So they're able to drink, but they're not to drink a lot. So these ascetics, they wouldn't be drinking any wine at all. Not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome. We're getting back to the problems before. And not a lover of money, which, when I read out what's going on in the church, that somehow these other teachers, Jimenez and Alexander, somehow being using their position to somehow shore up their own financial position.
Hmm. And
I mean,
and
you
that
can do that.
yeah.
We've had a big case in Australia of that.
Oh, I haven't heard anything about that.
No, that's our dear Hill song. Yep. Anyway.
Oh. So you said that you think that there was money related to what was going on. So is
It
that
would seem to be. I mean, he makes a big deal of it over in chapter 6 at the end.
okay? I see. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. That's very interesting. Okay. Alrighty. So a lot of people obviously think that you know I kind of misspoke earlier actually because I said that chapter 3 seems out of place to a lot of people when you look at it to the chapter before that. But of course, a lot of people think that this chapter 2:12 is talking about women not preaching. So this other similar position, like, hey, the overseers, they can teach, but the women can't, basically. So there's a way to
Yeah.
connect those
No.
in that specific view.
Okay.
Um,
So as I said, the overseer is overseeing the board of elders, which we talk. But there's no there's no kind of gender qualification for the elders. So because you have to have like if in a church, the Christian church is unique in a way because have men and women together, and so you need someone looking after the women. Because a man can't look after women in an appropriate fashion in a in a Greco-Roman society.
hmm,
So you need women leaders. So you've got
interesting.
women deacons. It's just that looks the man is it's probably because it's not universal. So he's directing his attention to like the church in Ephesus. This is the church in Ephesus we're talking about. Um, you know, so it's an important Roman city important city in the Roman Empire.
Hmm,
Um, and an overseer's job is to communicate with the out, you know, operate on behalf of the organisation he's overseeing as their spokesperson. So really, the only person that could do that appropriately is a man.
hmm,
It's just the constraints of culture.
hmm,
It's not because women somehow ontologically can't do this job.
hmm. Okay, so
Um, no, I
you,
think
you've yeah.
we don't know who the elders are, so because it's in the plural, it could be men and women elders. We don't know,
Hmm. Yeah, it's a little
and
vague. Yeah,
possibly they are because in Titus it talks about older men and older women who seem to have positions where looking after other believers in the in the church.
interesting. Okay, all right. So um, on that route a little bit. So yeah, so of course many have argued that this is First Timothy 2:12 is a public gathering of the church. So could you last question here? Could you maybe talk about, I guess, a little bit about the reasons why one would conclude that, and I mean, do you, if at risk of repeating yourself, could you talk just a little bit more about maybe what in the context do you think specifically would make you say, hey, yeah, this is not about a public church gathering?
Yeah. So other people think it's about public church gathering because it's about the prayer, and perhaps it is. But then, as I described before,
Uh-huh.
I think he's moving from public to private setting
Hmm.
um, because the other teaching is being done in two places,
Hmm.
um, and and if it is about giving up sexual relations,
Hmm.
then the actual living out of the other instruction is occurring in a bedroom in a private place.
Yeah.
Um, it's not happening uh, in a church gathering.
Mm.
But the instructions, though, the actual teaching of Humanisa could be in the governing of the church. So this is why I think it's moving from the public down to the private.
Mm.
It
Mm.
progressing, why he moves from like general men and women to husbands, wives, because he
Mm.
changes from the plural to the singular.
Yeah.
And then he talks about Adam and Eve, which in Jewish thought are husband and wife. Yeah. Josephus calls them husband and wife.
Huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Sandra Glahn makes the point that you have the saved in childbearing thought. So kind of related to the whole idea of the bedroom and sexual relations and all that.
Yes. And as I said before, holiness with modesty, I found that little, well, not the, maybe, what's the exact phrase? But those words are used together, to talk about, a wife's duty in the bedroom and to be, and how to conduct yourself
Hmm.
appropriately. Because they had some strange ideas. They thought that, if you conducted yourself in a respectable, modest way, that actually would affect the the character of the child that you were going to bear.
Mhm. Hmm.
So how you conduct yourself is important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on here and talking about your writings, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a lot of value out of this. Uh, is there anything else you wanted to say on the topic? Any last words?
No, I think we've been pretty comprehensive.
Yeah.
Given the time.
Yeah. Yeah. No.
Yeah. So
Y-
I noticed the time.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I appreciate you stay with us here. Um, well, I'd definitely recommend everybody checking out your different writings. So I've
Yeah.
linked them in the description.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you.
so yeah,
I'm
sure.
afraid that my dissertation is rather expensive because
Yeah.
it's published with an academic publisher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like almost a
But
hundred
that's
dollars or
why I
something.
wrote the book chapter called Aussie Men,
Uh,
Roma Men. It's kind of like a summary. Um, uh, yes,
yeah.
and in more accessible because it was going to be, it's free, open access. So
Right.
that's why I wrote that chapter.
I see. Yeah, it
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah, and you talk about other complementarian views and
Yeah.
um
So I want to be clear that I'm not I'm complementarian and
yeah.
egalitarian are theological terms,
Uh-huh.
but I'm not a theologian. I'm a New Testament scholar.
Uh-huh.
So I'm interested in what is going on and the historical background. So
Hmm.
what you do with what I have to say after this, from a theological point of view, is up to you.
Yeah, well maybe sometime we'll talk about what you do as and even though you're not a theologian, what you do with all this. Um
Yep,
yeah,
sure.
maybe one day. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I appreciate you coming on here. And yeah, we'll definitely have to talk about this some other time as well. But otherwise, I really do
Okay.
appreciate this, and
And
I do
thank you
hope you have
very
a good
much
yeah, and I
for
hope you have a
having
good
me
rest of your day.
on. It's been
Yeah,
great. Yeah.
awesome. I'm
Okay.
so glad. Yeah,
Okay.
well, thank you so much.
Bye.